Good evening. Welcome to the world tonight. It is March 12th, 2021. I'm Peter with Adam, and we have a loaded show as always for you. And I, for once, start off the show, and I will mention our big story of the week so far, the first big story of the week, and that is former Brazilian president uh, Lula da Silva, was released this week from his prison sentence. No, I should say, he was released. He was released. He was. Let me rephrase that. Sorry, I just had lunch. His conviction was nullified this week. Conviction, very much as future student of the law. Let me get this correct. His conviction of money laundering was removed this week by Brazilian authorities. And now he is a free man. And the important thing here is Lula had been planning to run at the last Brazilian election in 2018, but was not allowed to under Brazil's clean law. But since the conviction has now been nullified, he now can run in 2022, which now means there is a very, very good scenario that we may be getting a Lula versus Bolsonaro presidential election, which is to say this really changes the complexity of what Brazil's 2022 election may look like, as Bolsonaro has still remained popular, and there was always a question of who the opposition would have to unite around. But now with Lula out of prison, the now view of many is that he may very well be the opposition choice to Bolsonaro. Adam, thoughts on Lula's money laundering conviction being nullified?
Well, just looking at where we are at this moment and what polling tells us, we have a very interesting story. So there has been two sort of polling companies that have looked at this. Atlas Politico came out with two polls over the past few days, which shows that Lula would win in a second round in a presidential election. Obviously, 2022, it's far away, but he would beat Bolsonaro 55% to 45%. So, that's just one poll from them, which came out, which was actually leaked on the 9th. And then you also have another Atlas Political poll, which they released, which showed it being a little bit closer at 54-46 for Lula. But ultimately, again, showing quite a colourful picture for Lula in the hope that to actually beat Bolsonaro. Now, there have been a different story from a CNN poll with real-time big data, which shows that Bolsonaro would actually edge out a victory very slightly, with 52% to 48%. So at the moment, things are looking very close. And as I said, we're very, very far away from an election. Weirdly enough, actually, he isn't the best person to be going up against Bolsonaro, at least according to polls, he isn't. So, for example, from the sort of center right, you have Mandetta, who is actually polling better than Lula. In that same poll I just talked about, where it being 54-46 for Lula, Mandetta would actually beat Bolsonaro 56 to 44. So yeah, there are a wide variety of people that seem to be able to beat him. The real question is, will they back him? And it definitely seems like Lula has the edge in this, as in terms of in first round support, he has it pretty much solidified as being second place. No other candidate can really coalesce around him. And it doesn't look like Bolsonaro will be, losing out on that first place position anytime soon. So yeah, that's just what polls tells us. As I said, we're really far away. So we'll have to keep an eye out. And as election season in Brazil sort of hypes up, things can change drastically.
Indeed, the last presidential election was its own twist and turns, with many assuming Lula was going to run and then couldn't, and then we got Jair Bolsonaro very much cleaning that front. But yeah, I think your point is very true. I think there are others who are polling at least better than them, but they run the trouble that they may not necessarily get out of the first round because of Jair Bolsonaro and Lula both being their own characters and probably carrying enough weight to probably easily get over a threshold to go into a runoff.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's just the general thing. Maybe Lula will sort of lose that prestige as a candidate. It's this initial hype where people could beat him out. But as you said, who knows where it will go.
Fun, always Brazilian politics. And speaking of Latin American politics, our next fun country in Latin America, especially for those who love being on the Twitterverse, is Bolivia. The former president of Bolivia today had an arrest warrant put out for her, Janine Áñez, who many allege did a coup against the former president, Evo Morales, while her defenders say she was just following the rules. The Bolivian court is asking for arrest of her and her former ministers. It's sort of unclear exactly what has triggered this arrest warrant, but it seems to be something in regards to, I believe something, and you may chime in on this, Adam, because I really had a trouble with finding it. I believe it was something in terms of power for her involvement with
it's allegations of well, ultimately they've just said specifically allegations of terrorism, sedition, and conspiracy. Obviously the conspiracy element, sedition, is relating specifically to the coup, and terrorism, I think, is primarily relating to people being killed on the streets by security forces. So yeah, you know, what we're looking at with Bolivia is a very complex situation in which, you know, as many people have put it, was a coup. And to be honest, the more that I, you know, evaluate on it, I personally can understand that reasoning and have my own sort of opinions towards that side of things. And I think, to be honest, it is quite, you know, compelling as a viewpoint. But you know, this is a very drastic step forward and shows that the Bolivian government is taking a very serious step towards these people. So yes, who knows? I don't actually know what the situation is for Inez in terms of where she is, but their trial and the trial of ministers would be a probably fascinating affair to actually observe on the international stage. So, you know, there's that.
Yeah, I mean, the charges of terrorism and sedition, just as you were saying, that I finally had found the first link that actually mentioned it in full detail, again, is a very interesting one, of course, with the controversy that was the removal of Evo Morales. Of course, Morales is very much now back in the country after his little hiatus because of the new government. So it'll be interesting to see how this works. And of course, if she even is still in the country, of course, there's the Latin American tradition that of a president that was controversial to hitchhike out of there to avoid any possible future trouble down the road. So we'll find out if she's still in the country or whether she is somewhere else in Latin America or in the world that she's enjoying not being extradited to Bolivia. So it's an interesting saga. And then how the trial itself will operate, because obviously it will be, by supporters of her, be seen as a politically motivated trial that has no just meaning to it. So it'll be very fascinating to see how Bolivia maintains itself with a very charged atmosphere that trial will bring.
I just want to say one amusing thing out of all of this is that, of course, the way that Inez presented her sort of defense was on Twitter. So, you know, the lovely age of social media.
Twitter, I mean, every lawyer, I'm sure, in every part of the world cringes when their attorney says a statement on Twitter.
Yeah, well.
Anyway.
I also just wanted to say one final thing related to this. So recently Bolivia have had their gubernatorial elections and local elections, and the governor-elect of Santa Cruz, who is the sort of right-wing, I believe he ran for president but failed on the first round, Luis Fernando Camacho, he was also a key backer in trying to remove Morales. So do they get any kind of real legal repercussions for that? And how does that play for the voters who actually live in those areas? But that was just like a little side thing that I wanted just to quickly mention.
It'll be interesting to see if this is just against Inez, or whether this becomes a full-on arrest of many figures on the right who played their part in removing the previous government. But that remains to be seen. Speaking of the issues of government and arrest, we go to the lovely or dystopian place called Hong Kong, where Adam has an update on Hong Kong. Adam.
Yeah, so last week I talked about China's plans to change Hong Kong's election law, and we finally have an insight into what that is. So China's legislature has approved a resolution to completely change the way that Hong Kong is both governed and the way elections are conducted. So one of the major changes will be the composition of the election committee, which is basically an electoral college that selects the chief executive of Hong Kong. So this body will be expanded to 1,500 members, with an additional 300 members being appointed by the Chinese legislature. So a bit of lovely meddling there from the Chinese state. Additionally, in order to be able to run for the chief executive, a candidate must be nominated by at least 15 members of each of the 5 sectors of the election committee, which will also include the 300 members of the central government appointed sector. So evidently what's basically being said is that if you don't have at least 15 pro-China people on your side, then you are screwed and you cannot be the chief executive of Hong Kong. So that's like the major thing, which shows that the executive is basically tightly under wrap by the Chinese state. And also Hong Kong's legislature will be expanded from 70 seats to 90 seats. So the present system has 35 seats elected by party list proportional representation from geographical constituencies and 35 seats elected by functional constituencies. Basically, they're elected by the members of particular industries. So say, for example, finance or teaching. So under the new system, Hong Kong's legislature will also be partially composed of members appointed by the election committee. So what we're seeing now is that the Chinese state is directly picking people who will serve in the legislature. So the exact ratio of appointed and elected members has not yet been set, nor have any changes to the voting system used to elect the geographical seats. So, maybe there'll be 1 or 2, token opposition members. And the law will establish a committee to vet all candidates for chief executive, the legislature, election committee and local government. So while the criteria to be used to vet candidates has not yet been set out, it basically suggests that they'll need a sufficient amount of patriotism, which will probably mean they don't want democracy for Hong Kong. So before any of this takes place, the legislature of Hong Kong will need to directly amend the basic law of Hong Kong, after which the government of Hong Kong will enact the new laws in a similar way to last year's national security law. So essentially, once again, one country, 2 systems is dead. It's been dead for a while now, but they're beating that dead horse and seeing if it will produce any more pro-state opinions.
Indeed, I mean hello, Adam's dog.
Sorry.
No problem. Yes, this is interesting. As it mentions, this is pretty much the end of any form of democracy in Hong Kong, if there is any left, and pretty much now means that the new executive, once Mrs. Carrie Lam probably gets her new found position in Beijing for all her years of service of destroying the accords that were the Sino-Anglo Accords, now will basically be another puppet of Beijing. The two systems, one nation thing is long dead, and China just laughs at the world in irony of that they're powerless to do anything on the subject of Hong Kong.
Yep, exactly. Oh, and my dogs are barking again. Clearly they're big fans.
Indeed. On the point of China and regions, I'll lead this in, is that earlier this week at the United States Senate, the United States commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Philip S. Davis, spoke to senators about what he saw in the region. And he rose some intriguing points, but one very alarming point is that the U.S. believes now that it's losing its military edge in Asia, and believes that China is very much has eyes on Taiwan. And in his view, this is of course Admiral Davidson's view, that China will likely go for Taiwan as an annexation in the next 6 years. This of course rose a lot of surprise on Capitol Hill, that he's very explicit in his view that China was very much ready to go and wrestle control of the island from the Republic of China, which of course is many of you are aware that the People's Republic is the communist and the Republic of China is the island. Of course, his comments on on the island's potential to fall, possibly to China, comes just as U.S. and Chinese officials are due to meet up soon. And his other point is that he worries by 2050, the United States may not have any military edge left at all against China, which is a very dangerous, alarming statement from a senior officer of the United States. The government did not respond. The government as well on the belief of change of a potential military threat, though there was the commentary from the White House that they will ensure to maintain regional stability and control of Asia, which of course this is mostly coming off, as we mentioned, the Hong Kong thing, which is now a much different animal for China. Adam, thoughts on what the Admiral said earlier this week?
I mean, what else more is there to say? That, you know, clearly this is an expert who knows sort of their field. I think one of the, you know, key points that he stressed was the United States working with other democracies in the region to try and expand their own power and solidify a base. So, you know, that would be countries like Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, obviously Taiwan directly, and a whole host of other nations in the attempt to try and you know, create some real pressure on China that if they, you know, decided to ultimately expand one way, that it's gonna, you know, hurt them some other way. There are a lot of issues with this. You know, besides the allies of Australia, Japan, ultimately they're quite easy ones to work for the United States to work with. Same with South Korea and Taiwan. But with something like yeah, as I said, but I feel like for something like India, it's going to be a lot harder, and ultimately because of India's own recent, you know, rise in authoritarianism, in nationalism, you know, open Islamophobia. So a lot of concerns there on that side. So how does the United States work with that? But ultimately, you know, they've worked with worse before, so maybe that won't be any kind of barrier. But maybe it will. So that's just
funny
one
enough
edge
you mentioned
sort of
that.
look
He
at.
did mention their cooperation with India as well. He said that they had started to share intelligence and other information as well with the Indian military. So it looks as if the United States is very much treating India as the other partner now in the region as well, besides just a talking formation.
I mean, India has always prized itself on being the head of the non-aligned movement, you know, sort of stepping away from this Cold War dynamic. But maybe, you know, with an increasingly right-wing and nationalist government, which, you know, ultimately won't get along with the Chinese communist state, maybe it's somewhere where they look towards the United States. But, you know, then again, there's the issue of funding or assisting in military, which is, you know, a part of an increasingly authoritarian state.
And the other thing too is that Prime Minister Modi, who I'm sure if we had our own little segment on him would arise many emotions, has very much seen his view that India's future is to begin more cooperation with the West. And one thing Modi has done since he's been in office, I think since 2014, is increase his cooperation with the United States economically and militarily. And part of that military thing is you see China as a threat, which India, of course, and China had their own little clashes this summer right on their borders, which, of course, the two have a long history in that regard. Of course, the Modi's party has always been a little more pro-American than the Congress party from a traditional standpoint, so that may put it. And also the other thing is here is earlier last year it was reported the U.S. wanted to house a fleet in India, which is an interesting possible scenario for a future United States naval fleet based out of India would be very much a change from, as you mentioned, India's historic view as the non-alignment movement to becoming a U.S. partner in the region, should they host a U.S. fleet down the road.
Yeah, I read a great book, I believe by Peter Zion is the name of the author, who basically looks at he basically was talking about the decline of the United States, or the isolationism of the United States, because they don't need oil from the Middle East because they're getting it from Texas and places. But anyway, the actual interesting element, and shale gas, not oil, sorry, but the actual interesting thing behind the book was basically saying that India would be policing the Indian Ocean. So, you know, I can't remember specifically what the thought process says were behind thinking that the Indian Ocean would be sort of a major player in terms of regional dominance, because it basically doesn't seem to have a pretty big role, at least in geopolitics as a whole. But maybe it's an area the United States is sort of looking towards as a whole.
Well, yes, I think from what I read about the idea of housing an Indian fleet is that currently the Indian Ocean is shared by 2 U.S. naval fleets. So I think the idea there would be to reduce the burden, because I believe the 2 fleets that deal with that are the Middle Eastern Fleet and the Southeast Asia Fleet. So that new fleet would reduce that burden. But yeah, I think the interesting thing is, of course, the U.S.'s future. And I think the other point on this China thing is also where Taiwan is. I mean, the current president, I know you're very fond of her, has very much said in recent weeks that she will never allow Taiwan to lose a single inch to the communist to the communist China, which very much sees the point that Taiwan in the last few years has enjoyed a sort of resurgence in its relationship with Washington. Of course, Washington doesn't recognize Taiwan, but still has weaponry, which is now interesting to see whether the president of Taiwan, Mrs. Tell-Ing, pushes Washington to give her more weaponry than which already is due on the way from there, whether that includes now troops or even more offensive capabilities to stop a potential future Chinese military excursion or a blockade that has also been seen by analysts as a possible thing that China may do to Taiwan.
I mean, we can't forget about the fact that Anthony Blinken accidentally, or I presume accidentally, called Taiwan a country, which strayed entirely from US foreign policy for decades. So probably was just a slip of the tongue, as I imagine. But
possibly, or there may be a secret meeting.
Exactly, maybe. But very monumental there, and quite openly bold in aggression to the Chinese. I don't think there was an entire moment in the Trump presidency when there was a bold, an action so bold as something as symbolic as that, because right. China strongly, as in the PRC, strongly condemned any country which was, talks about Taiwan as a country. I mean, just a lot of their geopolitics in the South Pacific is them, giving islands that recognize Taiwan a lot of money and infrastructure to get them to change who they recognize. And if it's a larger country like the United States, they're far more aggressive in the way that they respond to those kinds of comments.
Indeed, and I think the other point is too, we've seen China take Hong Kong with ease. Taiwan, of course, is a much different ball game because it now involves bringing in other powers that China may not necessarily have a controlling factor in, that being the United States. So it's interesting to see what the powers in Beijing and Washington do in that regard.
Okay, very exciting. So going on from the United States and their position in Asia, we go to our favorite segment besides Loser of the Week. It's the Africa section or corner. I can't remember what we called it last time.
I think it's section.
Section, maybe. I like corner. But anyway, so we are going to Senegal. So protests have erupted over this week in Senegal, which has been considered a center of democracy and stability in the region, which is sort of a common thread on a lot of the countries we've talked about recently, at least in terms of Africa, where they've been sort of beacons of stability and have sort of descended a little bit. But now anti-government protests have taken to the streets, primarily in the capital city of Dakar. So why did the protests start? So a opposition leader named Sonko, who is 46, is an opposition politician who rose to prominence during the 2019 presidential election. He received about 15% of the vote, which meant he came third, but he became a very popular figure due to his condemnation of poverty, of government corruption, and it really sort of, resonated with a lot of people beyond those who just voted. So 46 is quite young for the country in terms of a leader, and he has been classified as a very, very good speaker. So it is very likely that he would be set to run in a future presidential election. However, Controversy comes because last week he was ordered to make a court appearance for questioning on accusations of rape. So, on his way to the courthouse, he was arrested for disturbing public order after hundreds of his supporters clashed with police who were trying to stop this unauthorized protest. And this has caused even further sort of outrage on the streets because of this general thing of people thinking that he is, being falsely condemned. So he was released on Monday, and sorry, he was on Monday. He was released from police custody after being charged with rape and making death threats. So he has those accusations solidly against them. So if he is actually convicted, he would end up facing 10 years in jail and would be barred from taking part in the 2024 election, which is the next presidential election. This would not be the first time that an opponent of the president in Senegal has been facing criminal charges ahead of an election. Apparently in 2013, the son of a former president was charged with corruption. He was sort of expected to one day run for the presidency, but ultimately served 3 years in jail before going into exile, and completely derailed his political career. Then you also have the mayor of Dakar, who is called Khalifa Sall, who was arrested on corruption charges and not pardoned until after the 2019 elections had taken place. And he was also seen as a candidate who could go for the presidency. So the basic summary of this is that the protesters see Sonko's arrest as just, another example of government meddling, of corruption, of the, people trying to push away any kind of opposition. And interestingly enough, there's been a lot of sort of media attention of which that has existed on these types of protests, which have targeted French retailers and French businesses in Senegal, who are also using this as a way of sort of, I guess, shouting out against both the global economic downturn, which COVID-19 has brought, but also the general overview that the French have sort of a very strong colonial grip on the country still. So that's an overview of the anti-government protest there. And that, there doesn't seem to be any sort of end in sight. The presidential elections are quite far away. So there is a lot of time for this to sort of brew over, but we'll make sure to continue keep covering these. And if they grow into anything else major, or Sonko actually has, maybe he's arrested, maybe he's actually charged and put into prison, or maybe, he's completely gotten rid of those charges against him. So another interesting story, but that's Africa Corner for me.
Yeah, I think a very interesting story. Sonko's arrest is a very disturbing trend in Senegal, which has been a very stable beacon of African democracy in a region that has not had that. And one can only imagine what will be the utmost reaction if he were to be formally convicted of what the demonstrations may be. And of course, the French criticism, of course, France very much, even though it is no longer an imperial power, very much has control monetary-wise of its former colonies in Africa via its monetary union. Before I move on, I just saw a comment in the section. I'll leave the other comment for Adam if he wants to address that his own. I will only address the comment about departure. Yes, the departure was marred by problems on those final weeks, and that's where the decision by certain actors were to remove Morales. Whether you think it was a coup or not, I'm not stating my opinion because I genuinely don't think it's worthwhile to go into it. But yes, there was the belief that Morales was the one who was not allowing for the country to move on. That's just the answer to the second question. The first question's up to Adam whether he wants to answer it or not.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my reasoning behind this is first of all, I'd like to state I do not think Evo Morales is a good leader. I think, anybody who tries and amends a constitution to try and fit the way of themselves staying in power, they're an awful person in that sense. Because ultimately power is something that should be passed on in a democracy, and if someone tries to stop that, they're no different than any other kind of autocrat. The main reason that I have been convinced by the argument that it was a coup is essentially that the very strong opposition by security forces against protesters, And then also the other element of the fact that the continued delay around elections and this almost clear desire by Inez to not relinquish power. But ultimately, again, it's not something that it's my own personal opinion. It's not something I need to go into too much, but that's just the general overview of why I'm convinced, not entirely, but I do have some sort of, I guess, understanding for that kind of argument.
Oh, and that's, I think, the beauty of the show is that we both have different opinions. I will put for the record, I don't think it was a coup. I think it was a justified removing, but we can have two different opinions and have a show because that's what makes the world nice.
Alternatively, you could think that it was a justified removing, but, the actual response afterwards was bad, which I think is basically kind of my position. I don't know. It's not something I have,
That's sort of
think
my
about
position
too much.
where it is. I think the removal was fine, just the process afterwards was a bit problematic.
Yeah, sure.
But anyway,
that's enough of personal opinion. That's not what people come for.
We have now the election rundown. Now, I'm technically supposed to go first, but I think the Israeli election rundown is more fun than the Dutch one. So I'm letting the Israelis go first. So Adam, fly away on the Israeli rundown.
Yeah, so basically what I want to do with this section is break it down into two parts. So the first part, which I'll talk about the parties that are running as quickly as possible. And who they are, who are the main actors, who that kind of thing. And then next week, before the election on the 23rd, I want to talk about what are some of the possibilities after the election, so everyone can get a sort of broad overview of what to expect when they're up on election night. They see the polls, they see the actual results, and they go, okay, this can happen. So I'm just going to try and go through this as concisely as possible. But essentially, the Israeli election, which takes place on the 23rd of March, follows a very turbulent time in Israeli politics, where you've previously had 3 elections in which there was no real clear consensus created, and so there was political instability, which meant that there was no clear majority for either political side, and there was a whole lot of confusion, essentially is the way to summarize it. But now, as a result of all of this confusion, a government formed back in, I believe it was April time. However, that's collapsed, so we're where we are now, with a 4th election in Israel in under 2 years. So the main players are Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. It's the major one that pretty much everyone, I think, has a clear idea of. It's Benjamin Netanyahu's vehicle for staying in power. It represents sort of general national conservatism, quite a bit of economic liberalism on the side, definitely some populism sprinkled in there as well. So maybe it's a bit of your a bit more of an extreme 2010 Republican Party. I don't know. But then you've also got on the opposition side, you've got a whole bunch of different parties. So I'll try and go over these as well as I can. So representing the centrist side of the opposition, you have Yesh Atid. This is a more liberal focused party. Its main center of power is sort of in Tel Aviv. And it represents a secular middle class in Israel. It's headed by Yair Lapid, who is a former journalist and is essentially the sort of main left-wing to centrist candidate who is trying to oppose Netanyahu. Now, on his right, and also is on part of this anti-Netanyahu opposition, you have the New Hope. So the New Hope was formed by a former Likud politician, Gideon Sa'ar. His New Hope is essentially a slightly more to the right Likud. It has more extreme views on things like the two-state solution and settlements and such. But it's trying to sort of represent this, I guess, Likud alternative, which, pardon me, is sort of staying to that original ideology. And then finally, on the right, you also have Yamina, which is the party of Naftali Bennett. It represents a definitely more right-wing ideology, and is the sort of anti-Netanyahu home for those who are on the right, but also a bit of Haredi Jews, so ultra-Orthodox Jews. So that's sort of an overview of the four major parties, that being, just to summarize, Likud on the pro-Netanyahu side, after all it's his party, and then you've got three parties on the centrist to right, which represent the anti-Netanyahu side. So just to quickly go over the rest of the sort of major players that we've got in Israel, you've got the Joint List, which it represents Israeli Arabs. It's made up of three parties, two of which are socialist and communist parties, and another which is a general Arab nationalist party. It wants a two-state solution and primarily represents the interests of Israeli Arabs. You've also got Shas and United Torah Judaism. They are parties that represent Haredi Jews. They are, quite right-wing socially. They're against LGBT rights, that kind of thing. However, quite left-wing economically, or at least they're left-wing economically if it benefits their community. So they like government subsidies, that kind of thing. You've also got on the secular right, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Yisrael Beitenu. This is a secular nationalist party which represents, well, it used to represent and still kind of does Russian speakers in Israel. It's formed by Avigdor Lieberman, a very controversial figure in Israel, but that's a different story. You've also got Meretz, which is a left-wing party. Not much to say about that. You've got Ra'am, which is also known as the United Arab List, which is an Islamist party. You've got Labour, which is this sort of former behemoth of a party. Was the party of the foundation of Israel, really, or at least has its roots there. It's a social democratic party, that kind of thing. And then finally, you have the Religious Zionist Party, which represents, as you'd guess, religious Zionists, but also is quite far right in a number of ways. For example, it contains the party Otzma Yehudit, which is a Kahanist party, which is a very extremist view, which is very anti-Arab, is essentially a form of wanting to have a theocratic Jewish state. But yes, I hope that very long-ish overview of the kind of parties that are going to be contesting Israel. Next week, when we do the sort of overview to the election, I won't describe the parties in the briefest sense. You can come back here just to get an idea of what they represent. If you're listening already, next week I'll go over, what's the possible coalitions that could form, what has been the major talking points of the election campaign, that kind of thing. So I hope you're looking forward to that.
I always enjoy talking about Israel. Of course, I don't really have a fun country, but I have.
Just a quick thing. Do you have any questions beforehand that you may want to ask, or do you just have a good understanding already
of Israeli politics? I'm not surprised, but with those parties, do you think there's any situation that any of these party leaders, obviously, have all said their statements, but any of one who may in particular, I know this might be asking the wrong question at the wrong time, but who may be the kingmaker in terms of forming the next Israeli government?
That is a fantastic question. So over the past few elections, this kingmaker position has really been held by Avigdor Lieberman. His Yisrael Beitenu was sort of seen, as a right-wing party, but it's secular, so it's against the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So yeah, it was.
He's not a fan of the radical Orthodox Jew. I was talking about Lieberman.
Oh yeah, I'm not a fan of him, to be honest, but there we are. Anyway, so yeah, he previously held this position. However, it's lost to him now. He's basically consolidated himself as a part of the anti-Netanyahu camp, a very firm part of it. So he isn't a kingmaker anymore. No, this time it's going to be Naftali Bennett with Yamina. So Naftali Bennett is a very interesting character. He's been in politics for quite a while now. I believe about 10 years or something like that. He was the chief of staff to Netanyahu for quite a while back, but entered politics with the Jewish Home, and he was if I remember correctly, defense minister for some time, but he fell out of favor with Netanyahu. He formed another party called the New Right, which was attempted to be a bit more secular. However, that sort of failed. But the real interesting look throughout his entire career is he has been a good friend of Netanyahu. He's been a bit sidestepped by Netanyahu every now and then. For example, one time when he wanted to be Minister of Defense, but was actually just given Minister of Education, which was sort of the downside of what he really wanted. But now in this election, he has, firmly come out. He's like, I hate Netanyahu. Well, he doesn't say I hate him, but he's been very firmly anti-Netanyahu. And his whole message of this election campaign has sort of been, the right can continue without Netanyahu. It needs a new face. It needs new ideas. And that's really what he's tried to present. So if there's anybody who's a kingmaker in this election, it's definitely him. Because of his history, in both being with Netanyahu and now being against him, it's very unsure to say if he will remain in that position and if he will actually decide to continue to stay against Netanyahu. So, for example, if the election is I don't know 58 for the anti-Netanyahu camp, and then you've got the other seats for the pro-Netanyahu camp, he could 100% decide to flip over and join the pro-Netanyahu camp if he was offered the right concessions. And that's essentially the sort of thing he's gone for. He said, if you don't make me prime minister, talking to Gideon Sa'ar, Yair Lapid, he's basically said, if you don't make me prime minister, then I will join Netanyahu. So yeah, he is 100% the kingmaker, not in the normal sense where kingmaker is usually neutral between elections. You don't know where they're going to go. No, he is 100% said, if you don't make me prime minister, I'll pick Netanyahu.
So is there a good chance that if there was an anti-Bibi government formed this year, he would almost certainly be the first, be the prime minister designate of that government?
So the way it will likely turn out is you'll have ultimately, when the election is here and done, let's say in this hypothetical scenario, Netanyahu doesn't get enough seats. What will happen is the president will ask, let's say in this situation, Netanyahu to come forward, try and form a government. He fails. Then it goes to the person who has the second amount of recommendations, which will probably be Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid will fail because if Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar keep up with their promise of not wanting to sit under Lapid because they see him as too leftist, then that will fail. And then in this third stage, this final stage, any member of the Knesset can present themselves forward and try and form a government. And that's when Naftali Bennett has said he will try and form a government. He says that is the moment in which he will, seize the reins and actually cobble something together.
Fun stuff. And it should be noted that one of the likely members of an anti-Bibi government or a current Bibi government is a former colleague of Yair Lapid's of his former party. That is Benny Gantz. They used to be together in blue and white, and that broke up because of Gantz deciding to join the Likud government last year.
Yeah, I mean, there was a fantastic phrase which I heard recently, which basically said that Israeli politics is the most humiliating political system, and you've definitely seen that with Benny Gantz and his Blue and White Party, which has only sort of hovered around the electoral threshold of 3.25%, and he has had quite an embarrassing campaign, I'd say, not in the sense of like. Yeah, not in the sense of him being like not being able to actually, be above that threshold, but just in the sense that there's a lot of personal humiliation. Yeah, exactly. He's had to say, for example, I wanted to trust Netanyahu. Obviously, he backstabbed me. But, the signs were there. But yeah, he's had a lot of a few interviews where he's, one-to-one with a journalist, and, it's quite sad, really. But yeah.
Moral of the lesson is don't betray the voters who put you in, who elect you to take someone out. Anyway,
yeah, that could apply to so many people in Israeli politics, though.
Yes. Anyway, so moving on from Israel, we now go to the Dutch, who have an election scheduled for the 17th of this week. Now, unlike Israel, it's not as fun because it's sort of seen that there's sort of a picture to be known. So we'll first start off with the basic background. The current Dutch government was already due to have an election. It resigned over a scandal we mentioned here a few weeks ago on the World Tonight, but that scandal really hasn't done anything to hurt this government. Now, the government is led by Mark Rutte, who has been Prime Minister of the Netherlands since 2010. Fun fact, if he were to serve out a full term of a fourth term, he would become the longest serving Dutch Prime Minister in history. Yes, in history. He's only a year away from passing the mark. So now let's look at the parties. The parties themselves are rather interesting. So there's Mr. Rutte's party, which by all polling will come in first and probably by a wide margin from everyone else. Some polling has it at 32. Some has it as high as 40. Again, Dutch polling tends to be a little odd in how it does its sampling, but assuming that. Now, Mr. Rutte's party, which has been in charge since 2010, is the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. Is a conservative liberal party, very much your classic, they're not in the traditional European conservative grouping, but they're effectively a conservative liberal party, very much free market economics and all that fun jazz, just a little socially moderate and whatnot. The second place party second place, depending on the poll you look at, seems to be a contest between two different parties. One is the Party for Freedom, which is led by the very controversial and very much seen Islamophobe Geert Wilders, who, of course, has made a career of himself saying lovely comments about Islam in the Netherlands, and very much basically integrating very harshly Muslims, people of Islam in the Netherlands into Dutchness, and banning other parts of the Islamic religion, such as shutting down mosques and the Quran. It, of course, ironically, was in one government coalition, the original Mark Rutte government, but that didn't last very long because they crashed it. They probably will not form any They will not form any government at all with this VVD. They will almost certainly be the largest opposition party in the chamber. The next party is the CDA, which is the Christian Democratic Appeal. Of course, as the name kind of gives off, they're kind of a Christian party almost in the conservative sense. Very moderate-ish on moderate-ish on econ, but still pretty much a bit to the right on econ. It's part of the EPP grouping. They, of course, believe in Christian democracy and some social conservatism. They were the last non-VVD government in the Netherlands. The next party up in the polling is the Democrats 66, which is a socially liberal party, which is very much the liberalish party, metropolitan liberal party of the Netherlands, very much a party of those who've done well in the Netherlands, basically. The VVD and the CDA are much more the business and, the middle-class party. The next party up is the Groene Links, which is basically the Greens. They've been in the Netherlands since '89. They are very much of the left, very much your classical Green Party in Europe, very much ecologically based. Also probably will not be a part of the next government, which is the current coalition, just for those who probably will ask, is the VVD, the CDA, D66, and the CU. We'll get to the CU in a moment. The next party is the Socialist Party. It is, of course, the more other left-wing party of the Netherlands, very much of the left. It is never really been in government at all, if its party's creation at all. It's mostly been avoided by Labour, which has historically been the party of the center-left in the Netherlands. But yeah, there's the Socialist Party, which is sort of hovering around in the mid-teens. The next party is the Christian Union Party, which again is a centrist Christian party that is very much, again, based on religious beliefs with the conservative bent. They're also part of the EPP and very much looking like they're going to hold their front. The next party up is the Party for Animals. As you can guess, it's an animals type party, very much believer in animal rights and welfare. Somewhat of a meme in terms of what it believes outside of animal rights, kind of a mix of some, soft Euroscepticism and some left-wing positions. So very interesting grouping there. And then the next party is the 50-plus party, which is the pensioners party in the Netherlands, very much a pensions power party that very much seeks to protect the rights of pensioners. Next party also up is in the Reformed Political Party, which is a conservative, orthodox, Calvinist party. Yes, folks, Calvinism still exists, which its biggest thing is it opposes universal suffrage in the Netherlands and seeks to replace this with a form of organic suffrage, which effectively means the male of the household gets to vote in elections. No women, no nothing. It also supports reestablishing the death penalty and bring back the ban on gay marriage. They won't form a government at all. No one tends to try to work with them because of their fun views, as we will put it for that. The next party up is DINIC, which is sort of an interesting one. It split from Labour back in 2015. Labour was in a VVD coalition. It, of course, is a center-left to left-wing party. It, of course, is very much of an Arab interest. Very much, of course, is run, of course, has very much had a interesting bent towards Arabs in the Dutch society. It is very much Turkish, Moroccan. It's anti-racist, but it's also anti-Zionist, which, of course, has run itself into trouble with the Jewish community in the Netherlands. It's also socially conservative and very much believes a strong, identity-based politics. Next one is the FVD. Oh, and I actually forgot. My apologies. I didn't mention Labour. I passed them. Labour Party, of course, is the Social Democratic Party of the Netherlands. Couldn't forget about them. They were the historically dominant party of the country, but till recently have started to slip in that regard. They have gone from being one of the larger parties to getting down for going into coalition with the right, and also having that scandals we mentioned earlier in the world tonight hit them. They, of course, are the Socialist Party. They may or may not possibly be in the next government, depending, of course, if the current government can hit 76 seats, which most polling has them ranging from 73 to 78 seats. So it's sort of a line of whether the current coalition wins outright or whether they may have to seek an additional party. The rest is the Forum for Democracy, which was made by Tierno Blunt, which was sort of a right-wing Eurosceptic party, which at one point was polling very high, but then got into trouble. So it got into trouble with scandals with racism and anti-Semitism, which crashed it in the polls and caused numerous leading figures of the party to leave because of these issues. They've gone from a high water mark of being in first or second place to now very much at the low point. And the other two are JA21, which is basically a right-wing party that split off from the Forum for Democracy by just in 2020. It currently has no seats in the House of Representatives, but is seen to likely gain 1 or 2 seats. They may or may not be the party that may help the VVD ironically get over the line, but they're right-wing and very much a believer in what we do describe as classical right-wing thought. And then the last party is Volt, which is a pro-European party, which very much is sort of a very liberal progressive view, center or center left. In terms of the government of what would happen, it's very likely that, as I mentioned, the current coalition will either win a majority or be very short of one.
I think you missed out the most exciting thing about Volt Europa. Actually, do they even have the Europa bit on their name anymore? I can't remember. Anyway, so Volt is Volt Europa is a Euro Federalist party.
Euro Federalist, I forgot that. Yes.
Yeah. So if you want a European state, United States of Europe, if you will, that's the party for you.
Sounds like someone I know on Twitter, but I won't say his name to not get him angry if he watches this show. Anyway, but yes, any questions you have, Adam, in that regard of my lovely rundown of that?
Oh, I don't know. Are there any possible coalitions that could form that aren't, the current one? Because I've heard a lot about the fact that D66 is likely not going to take up another coalition with the party of the Prime Minister. So are there any other possible configurations?
So if the D66 were not to join, which would kind of be an interesting scenario that it didn't join, but maybe I can get it ideologically, it probably doesn't make sense for them.
They've suffered a lot as a part of this government as well.
They have.
There's
The
a drop in
current polling
support.
does have them basically keeping the same amount of seats that they had at the last election, or gaining one. So that's the latest polling I have up checked here. But if they were to decide to pull out, depending on which poll it is, if they're right at the majority, that would take away about 14 seats. So then, in that regard, they'd have to go and find seats in that regard, which complicates the business of forming a government because the CDA has had its criticisms of the VVD, but they tend to sit with each other because they're natural parties of the right. The Christian Union is liked being in government, so it's not going to complain. The only places where I could see possibly them finding places is if Labour is willing to go back into government, but that's a big if, because the last time they were in government, of course, it didn't end well for Labour. They got crushed at the polls. Or the other is to go with the, that JA21 party, if it's right on the edge and going with that. But I expect there'll be a big push for D66 to try to stay in the government and possibly a bigger reward for them to entice them to stay so they don't have to collapse the current coalition, which, if it were to remain in the higher end of polling is to be believed, would comfortably be back in.
Very interesting. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that very exciting rundown.
Indeed. And after the nerdy rundown, we have now gone to our favorite subject of the week, the loser of the week. And I'll let Adam go off on saying his loser week. A very fun one.
Okay, so this is a bit of an exciting, crazy story. So I'll just read about it. But the loser of the week this time round is the Nepal Communist Party. Now, this is the governing Nepal Communist Party. So I'm just going to read what I wrote. So the Supreme Court has invalidated the registration of the governing Nepal Communist Party. So in 2018, two of the three main parties in Nepal, that being the Communist Party of Nepal, which it also has Unified Marxist-Leninist in its name, and the Communist Party of Nepal, which has Maoist Centre in its name, merged to form the Nepal Communist Party, which is henceforth referred to as the NCP. So the newly created party now had a majority in its legislature, with, obviously because of the two factions being combined, with the United Marxist-Leninist leader Sharma Oli becoming prime minister and sharing chairmanship of the party with the Maoist leader Kamal Dahal. So the same year, Rishiram Ketal, leader of the already existing Nepal Communist Party, named without the NCP abbreviation, launched a lawsuit alleging that the NCP was wrongly registered because its name was too close to his own party's name. Now, on March 7th, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Ketal, and due to this ruling, the court said that the original merger is annulled and that the party returns to its original components, that being the Communist Party of Nepal, United Marxist-Leninists, and the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist Centre. However, all of this has happened in the midst of a factional war between Oli and Dahal, which dramatically escalated in autumn 2020, effectively already splitting the party. Now, Oli remains PM, but was removed from his co-chairmanship several months ago, and both he and Dahal sought the rights to the party until the recent Supreme Court ruling, which complicated the factional split. So the dispute is further complicated by the fact it does not fall along the lines of the old parties. Some former members of the United Marxist-Leninists are with the Dahal, and some former Maoists are with Oli. There is also now confusion over what party many legislators are now legally part of. It is legally possible for the two parties to reunite, but given the already existing factional disputes, it seems unlikely. New elections could resolve it, but they are not guaranteed to happen this year. Oh my God, this is such a Judean People's Front and People's Front of Judea situation, but it's literally happening in real life. What more loser behavior can you get than that? I hope my explanation gave some insight to it, but basically, two parties merged, had similar name that forced them to split. They were already basically in the middle of splitting, so it's a whole bunch of mess. That is my loser of the week, because oh boy, it's just a bit of Monty Python.
Yes. Now, my loser of the week, sadly, is not very much that inciting. My loser of the week is Andrew Cuomo. You know, last year around this time, the
Yep.
media in this country called him the great hero America needed when Donald Trump was not doing whatever on COVID, whether you believe that or not. Of course, that's before he threw grandmas to death and grandma and grandpa to death in his nursing home scandal. But now Mr. Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, I should say, depending how long he gets to be called Governor Cuomo, has been accused of sexual assault by 8 women. Yes, folks, 8 women. I'm not kidding. 8 women have said he sexually assaulted them. Well, harassed them, assaulted them, I should say, both. He, of course, has said, because he's an Italian guy, he loves touching women just a little harder than most people. And he's also said he's now a victim of cancel culture. That's right, folks. A governor who was accused of sexual assault and harassment on a live TV press conference said, I am guilty of cancel culture. And to make matters worse, Cuomo has said he's done nothing wrong and says this is all a partisan hit job against him by the right. Of course, it's funny because it's the left who's actually done this. But yes, Cuomo, who last year was talked about as this democratic savior of how to run COVID, which really he never was, has now very much fallen loser of the week. As we have done this show tonight, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has called on him to resign. And other members of the New York Democrats started to. Now, the question is, will he resign? He likely won't. He will probably have to be impeached. And if he does, Cuomo will have gone from a media darling in one year to being impeached out of the other year. As someone put on Twitter, he's a Democratic version of Donald Trump. And I think that version, that comment may be getting proven right and wrong. Just in this case, he gets convicted, unlike Trump.
Yeah, because maybe there's a bit of backbone in his party there. But anyway,
well, to be fair though, let's not act like Democrats have been perfectly moral here. I mean, there is a Democratic governor in Virginia who did wear blackface and is still here. So,
yeah, very true, very true. I do think hopefully this is, if he does get impeached, fingers crossed, because what a disgusting man. But I hope he does. It really does send a picture that people should be impeached if they do awful things. And here's hoping that some politicians grow a spine and decide to actually call on getting rid of those who deserve to be gotten rid of.
The taxpayers pay for in the governor's mansion, even worse, or at private dinners.
Wow. Yep. I mean, yeah. What more can you say than the fact he is a?
Apologies for my language if anyone here doesn't like it, but he's a scumbag.
Yeah. I think that's the nicest way you can put something like that. But yeah, I mean, yeah,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. What a loser! What a loser! Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very.
Actually, I think has he been loser the week before? I think he has, hasn't he, over the nursing home scandal?
Yeah, yes, I did have him. I've had him as a loser of the week before.
So
it was nursing home.
Does that make him the first 2-time winner of the loser of the week? I'm not caught up on my election. I'm not caught up on my the World Tonight law, but possibly. Wow.
Look, Andrew Cuomo has won this distinct privilege of being loser of the week, killing grandma and grandpa, and now a sexual assault and harassment. Kids, that's that's the governor of New York.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, what a fun note to end this all on.
Indeed. Anyway, follow Elections Daily on a more lighter note on Twitter, and you can find us on wherever you listen to your Spotify or podcasts or whatever you listen to these days, because everyone seems to have their own thing. Maybe we should have a World Tonight Clubhouse, because that's also a thing now.
Yeah, I don't understand what Clubhouse is, but yeah.
Anyway, folks, have a great night. Hope you stay safe, and if you're eligible to, get the vaccine.
Yep, because it's coming to you soon. Well, if you live in a country that's got a good sort of grapple on it.
Could always be someone. We could have someone here who lives from Chile, and they've been very lucky to get the Pfizer and the Modernas of the world. Anyway, good night.